Let's move on now to another controversial subject, and that is about Scotland. It's expected to pass the controversial transgender legislation. This is the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. Essentially, this bill will remove the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria in order to receive a gender recognition certificate. These are very controversial reforms indeed. It would lower the minimum age for applicants to 16 and reduce the time required for an applicant to live in their required gender from 2 years, which it is currently, to 3 months or 6 months for people aged 16 and 17, although there will be a 3-month reflection period. So this has been a marathon session in the Scottish Parliament. It went on yesterday, and today the MSPs will consider the last of the 153 amendments lodged at stage 3 of the bill after that marathon session yesterday. In fact, the scenes were quite extraordinary. The sitting was disrupted by protests from the public gallery, and the opponents of the bill were shouting, "Shame on you." So clearly this is very controversial indeed. Let's talk to Miranda Yardley now, who is a human rights activist. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Can I just ask, in terms of this legislation, are you in favour?
I think it's terrible legislation. I think the whole way that it has been done and the way that it has been pushed is as an affront to democracy.
So just in terms of this, I mean, the transgender lobby is very powerful now. It seems to me, I'm very concerned about this. The fact is that I do think that younger people, and there's been a lot of evidence about this, even the NHS said that most children who believe they're transgender are going through a phase. This was the NHS's own ruling in the last few weeks. I'm deeply worried when you remove that age and lower that age where you can do this and consent to this, but also reduce the time that you have to spend living in that acquired gender. That to me spells enormous concern and worry.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole concept of this transgender identity is masking a whole load of other problems that are just not being addressed with the children that are claiming to have these identities. I think that putting young children onto this pathway where they have this special gender thing affirmed by adults creates an environment that puts the child into on a pathway from which it's going to be very difficult for that child to get away from. We don't know how many children will go on from being children to being adults who will seek to change their acquired gender, whatever that means. And it's, I think, like smoking, this is something that only adults should be allowed to do. And even then, they should be questioned about why they're doing it.
I mean, I think it's particularly and very normal and natural for children to dress up as a different gender, for boys to dress as girls, girls to dress as boys, but that doesn't mean that you're actually living in the wrong gender. And I think, having discussed this a great deal on talkTV, I'm just deeply nervous about what this message sends out. Why is Nicola Sturgeon making this her personal mission to change this in Scotland?
Well, that's a really good question. If you look at the alliance that Nicola Sturgeon has forged in Scotland with the Scots Greens, who have some particularly way out beliefs on ideas to do with gender, I think this really is a cynical attempt to create a conflict of laws between Scotland and the UK to allow Nicola Sturgeon to present to Scotland another case for independence. You may remember a few years ago that Scotland had an independence vote and Scotland voted no. And since then, the SNP has done little other than garner support across the country, effectively creating a one-party state. And I think now what she's trying to do is she's going to use this as a wedge issue to try and present a conflict with the rest of the UK in a very cynical manner and try to push for independence. Again.
In terms of this legislation, it is a crucial piece of legislation. It needs really careful consideration, and rightly, some MSPs are deeply worried about where this goes. They've tabled amendments to try to ensure that this bill doesn't put children and young people in serious risk. Now, there's also been a letter sent to some of these Scottish Conservative MSPs basically saying, take the amendments off because the bill will be jeopardised. Isn't that the whole point of an amendment, to make sure that the legislation that is passed is actually right, accurate, fair and proportionate?
Well, there you go. Like I said, the whole way that this has been done is an affront to democracy. You'll notice as well that with the voting last night, there was resistance towards their. It was a very close vote. I think it was 60 to 63 that it was opposed, that they wanted to have a clause put in the law that would prevent anybody who was a registered sex offender from changing their acquired gender. You see with these laws, this has been happening for years, decades. When these laws are introduced, there is never ever any consideration given to the possibility that there might be bad actors. It could go a long way to making legislation like this, or lessening the negative impact of legislation like this, if it was if it was drafted so that there was no possibility of bad actors using it.
Can we just move on to another story now? Look, it's really important that trans people are treated with dignity and respect, but the NHS, and there's a headline this morning saying the NHS is going to spend £100,000 teaching staff how to talk to pregnant transgender men. They are going to include controversial terms such as chest feeding, and obviously this is highly controversial in itself. This is at, I'm not surprised at all to hear it's at the University Hospitals in Sussex, and I just wondered what your personal feelings are on this, and whether this sort of post is needed.
Well, here we go. Well, we're now talking about a second issue, which of course is going to affect women and girls disproportionately. And here we are, two males having that conversation.
Indeed.
And in response to your question about what the NHS are doing, I would like to borrow the words of the women from Women's Place, who said that what the change in language does is that it reduces women to bodies whose sole function is to carry and give birth to babies. Both this move and both the legislation in Scotland is very similar to quite a popular drama that's running on television at the moment. I don't know if you've heard of The Handmaid's Tale.
Indeed, indeed. So just in terms of, I mean, if we're talking about the NHS that is strapped for cash, I mean, it seems to me that I'm not sure that this is the best use of NHS money.
Well, I think this... there is a whole diversity and inclusion industrial complex arisen in the last decade, which is, of which groups like Stonewall and Agenda and Gyrus are all part of, and that they suck up public... Oh, mermaids as well. Let's not forget mermaids.
And, of course, the Tavistock Clinic, which obviously ran into serious trouble.
Yeah, and these organisations suck up public money, and what do they deliver? Effectively, they are delivering a faith system and imposing it on other people with a demanding, making a big ask upon people to change their language and change how they think about what happens in the real world, and of course, disproportionately, these things affect women and girls. It's women and girls who are going to be affected by both the legislation that's happening in Scotland, and it's women and girls who are going to be affected by changes to maternity services. All good for women who want to live as men, but if you're going to carry a baby and give birth, that's probably the most womanly thing you can do.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good to talk to you. That's Miranda Yardley, who's a human rights activist. After the break, I'll be taking your calls, your thoughts and your opinions. This is talkTV broadcasting live from the Talk Radio studios.